All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. Thanks so much for being here with me today. I'm your host, Nolan. A couple big stories to discuss today. The first one out of Ukraine, where the Trump team has now essentially devised a 28-point peace plan, basically headed up by Steve Witkoff, to potentially bring an end to the Russian-Ukraine war, which has been going on for years now and has essentially just been a slow grind away at the Ukrainian forces for the Russian side. And the Trump team seems to be hoping that this could be the beginning of negotiations to bring this bloodbath to an end. And there have been mixed reactions from the Europeans and the Ukrainians. So we'll get into all the reactions from those guys over there. I'll give you guys my thoughts. And then later on in the show, we're going to be discussing Mike Huckabee's adventures in the Holy Land, where he is, as you guys know, he's ambassador to Israel. He had a meeting back in July. The New York Times just broke the story, unplanned, unknown to the White House meeting with a former Israeli spy. So every day is something new with the Trump team when it comes to Israel and relations to that country. So we'll give you guys my reaction. We'll get into all this today and more on the Quest for Clarity podcast.
Americanism, not globalism.
I am not a slave. I am a free citizen.
There should be no Federal Reserve System.
Only America first.
End all of these wars. America is trying to play empire. We want everything released, and you're actively covering it up. It's not America first to be pushing our influence in areas where it shouldn't be. We're run by people that don't understand what they're doing and don't understand the ramifications of the policies they're enacting. That's an incredibly dangerous situation. All right, guys, before we begin, if you wouldn't mind going right down below this video and hitting like and subscribe, I'd really appreciate that. It helps me out a lot. Also, if you wouldn't mind going to my Instagram, X, and Spotify accounts and giving all those a follow, I'd really appreciate that as well. But let's get into the news of the day. As I just said in the intro there, the Trump team, led by Steve Witkoff, who was essentially the leader in drafting up this peace plan, have developed a 28-point peace plan to begin negotiations to hopefully bring the Russia-Ukraine war to an end. And I'll just start off here by reading this article from CBS News, where essentially they go over the basic points. There's 28 points. You can go read it for yourself. There's a lot of articles out there laying out all the 28 points. Here's the gist of the 28 points. Here are the main concessions that Ukraine is expected to make in this deal. The first one is that they're expected to give up most of the eastern regions that they have lost control of. Places like Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk are the main ones where they will be expected to give up a lot of land to Russia. And that was before a big red line for the Ukrainians and the Europeans. They said that absolutely not. Ukraine must maintain, if you remember back at the beginning of this war, this was the talking point, that Ukraine must maintain its territorial integrity. They must return to original borders, and even some of the biggest war hawks were at the start of this advocating for Ukraine to regain control of Crimea, which any sensible person knew wasn't possible. But this has been floated up as a potential that we may go to war and be at war and support Ukraine until that happens. So the biggest psychopaths were advocating from the start, but now we have this beginning of negotiations here, which is essentially acknowledging reality that barring some massive intervention militarily from the West and really from the United States, that there was no way Ukraine was going to get, especially Crimea back, but also most of Donetsk and Luhansk and these eastern regions that Russia has controlled for years now at this point, since really the beginning stages of the war. So we read here from the article, it says, quote, "The plan calls for the Ukrainian oblasts of Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk to be recognized by the U.S. and others as de facto Russian territory. Crimea was fully annexed by Russia in 2014, and the Russian military has occupied most of Donetsk and Luhansk, collectively known as the Donbass, since its full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in February of 2022. Parts of the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine were first occupied by Russia-aligned forces in 2014. Crucially, parts of Donetsk are still under Ukrainian control, would also be ceded to Russia, according to the proposal, but would be deemed a neutral buffer zone with no Russian military presence. So that's the first big point, these land deals, these essentially giving up hope that the Ukrainians will get this land back. And as harsh as it sounds, and of course, you have to have some sympathy here if we're just looking at this from a third-party perspective, I know the U.S. isn't really a third party in this, but if you are looking at it from the perspective of an average person here in the West, how can you not have sympathy for the Ukrainian civilians now that may not want to be part of Russia? And of course, there have been polls out there that say many of the people in these regions have voted, actually time and time again, that they would be okay with being part of Russia. But there are, of course, people that are not okay with that. So you have to feel for those people. But if we're looking at reality on the ground, and if we're looking at it from, as I always like to do, from an America First perspective, then no, it's not worth the money. It's not worth the endless attention for years and years and years. And it's certainly not worth American lives to fight till the death for eastern regions of Ukraine. It's just not. And from the United States perspective, this is not top of the priority list. And we've had leaders in the past, especially under the Biden administration, that think it is. And that's completely out of whack priorities. So the next major thing to come out of this potential proposal was that Ukraine must cap its military size. So right now, the estimates say that Ukraine has about 880,000 troops right now. And I highly doubt that that's the case. Just because we've seen the reporting, and if you're following like the real news, like people like antiwar.com that have on the ground sources, then you know the mainstream media narrative, which is that Ukraine is going to live to fight, and like it's all kind of showmanship, because in reality, the Ukrainians alone never stood a chance, and the reality is that they are dragging old men, like 70-year-old men, off the streets of Ukraine violently. We've seen the videos. They literally pull up, Ukrainian officers literally pull up on the street to these old men and throw them in the car viciously and force them on the front lines. We had J.D. Vance call out Zelensky on this back a couple months back. This is the reality, and they are very short on men. They just are. This is a reality. So I don't know that the 800,000 men estimate is correct necessarily, but that's the estimate, the mainstream estimate that they're giving out there, most likely playing into the Western media, as they still have a bunch of men that are still able to fight for longer, which I don't believe. But this 28-point peace plan would require them to have no more than 600,000 people in its military, and the Ukrainians are very upset with this. And from the Ukrainian perspective, if we put ourselves in that perspective, you can't really blame them for not liking this, especially since they were just invaded. And again, it's not bad to have strategic sympathies here and feel and kind of put yourself in the shoes of all sides of this. As someone myself who believes that this war was largely the result of NATO provoking Russia into this invasion over decades, it doesn't mean I can't feel for the Ukrainian civilians that have had their lives ruined because of this. I can. And I can acknowledge that as a Ukrainian citizen now who's been at war for almost 4 years, then yeah, it doesn't necessarily feel great that you have to be limited to a smaller military than you even have now after that 3 years of fighting. So you can understand where that would feel bad for the Ukrainians. But again, from the Western perspective, and really more specifically from the American perspective, we have to look at the causes. We have to have a sober analysis of what caused this war. And if we're being honest about what caused this war, it was Western buildup in Ukraine. It was the threat of Ukraine joining NATO that just days later resulted in this invasion. If you remember, Kamala Harris literally said that we were going to get Ukraine into NATO, and then days later, the invasion happened. So, and of course, there's more history to this. There was 2014, the Euromaidan coup, essentially, which the CIA funded to the tune of $100 million, these uprisings in Ukraine that overthrew the government that was aligned with Russia. So there's a long history here. And it is important now that we acknowledge what happened to that. That was Western collaboration with Ukraine that really provoked a lot of what we saw in this war. So that is probably, I'd assume, going to be negotiated a bit. Zelensky is now saying that he wants to negotiate on these points. He's very reluctantly doing so because he doesn't really have another option at this point. If the U.S. backs out, then they're kind of stuck. So he has to kind of make do here. But that's that point. The next point is probably, this is a very, from an American's perspective, this is a great point. It's no NATO membership for Ukraine, but they can join the EU. And that is, of course, acknowledging reality here, that is the key to trying to get some lasting peace here. And I would highly encourage everyone to go watch people like Scott Horton on this. Go read antiwar.com, and you'll understand that the real reason that Russia felt so provoked by what was happening in Ukraine, or felt for decades that the West was poking at them, was because they made it very clear that NATO membership for Ukraine, having NATO troops, having Western troops on Russia's border, was unacceptable. And for years, for decades, really, we were poking and prodding at them, basically trying to provoke them into a response, because we literally knew this. We acknowledged this for years. Condoleezza Rice knew this, and then would go on months after hearing about this directly from Ambassador Bill Burns back in 2008. He sent her a memo called the Niet means Niet memo, which means no means no in Russian. He sent her a memo that explained to her, he was explaining to her that all sides of the Russian political spectrum thought that NATO membership for Ukraine was unacceptable. That was a message from Ambassador to Russia, Bill Burns, to Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State at the time. And she, knowing this, months later would go on to anyways say that we were going to eventually get Ukraine into NATO. So it was Western recklessness, in large part, that caused the invasion of Ukraine. Of course, the only person responsible for the actual invasion is Vladimir Putin. And of course, he's guilty of a lot of war crimes for what he's done to the Ukrainian people. But that doesn't take away from the decades of buildup and rising tensions directly caused by Western provocations in the region, whether it be overthrow of governments or backdoor deals or any of it. So no NATO membership for Ukraine is, of course, from an American perspective, a good thing, because that was, again, if you've looked into this, that was one of the main provocations that Russia saw as a red line. And they said for years in the memo that Bill Burns sent to Condoleezza Rice, it was they told him that it was a decision they did not want to have to make, and the decision being an invasion of Ukraine. So we all knew this, and this is just accepting reality at this point. So that is essentially the big concessions that Ukraine would have to make in this deal. Another part of this deal is that Ukraine, in 100 days from this deal's acceptance, would have to have elections. So that's kind of a separate issue. And I'm sure that is something important to watch, though, because I'm sure from all sides there is going to be heavy meddling in that election, whether it be from the CIA or from the Kremlin. So very interesting to see what happens there in whatever time frame that happens in. But that is basically the gist of the 28-point plan. Now, the Europeans were very unhappy with this, and they made it known that they were going to come to Ukraine's defense. Here's what a French general said. Here's what a French general said in a speech right after this got announced. This is French Defense Staff General Fabien Mandon. He said, quote, "We have all the knowledge, all the economic and demographic strength to dissuade Moscow's regime. What we're lacking, and that is where you have a major role, is the strength of soul to accept pain to protect what we are." He would then go on to say, quote, "If our country is weak because it's not ready to accept losing its children, because it's better to say things clearly and to suffer economically because the priority will be the defense sector, then we are at risk." So one of the lead generals, or the head of their defense, basically, in France, is essentially saying that the reason that Ukraine is losing support in the West from the United States, potentially from some factions in these European countries, of course, the factions that aren't in power, because Europe has for years now been delusional in their support for Ukraine, their endless support. But he's saying that much of the reason for this is because their societies, unlike Russia's, aren't controlled in the sense that they are ready to send their children to die for these insane causes, like he's saying Russia's is. So his prescription to why the West isn't fully backing Ukraine is that we need to manufacture our culture and our society to value our children's lives less and Ukrainian territorial disputes more, and be willing to kill our children in defense of eastern Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Psychopath. Full-blown psychopath. And that is and don't think that's just one guy being insane. This is the mindset of people like Emmanuel Macron, Keir Starmer, all these European leaders who for years and years have been lobbying DC to try and get full, complete military support, basically, for Ukraine. And lobbying us to increase our spending, get this aid package passed, get that aid package passed. It was Boris Johnson who, back at the beginning of this war, when Zelensky and Putin had a deal worked out, flew out and told Zelensky to not take the deal because the West wasn't ready to make a deal yet. That was look this up. This is what he told Zelensky. Boris Johnson, former Prime Minister of England, or former Prime Minister of Great Britain, told Zelensky that the West wasn't ready to make a deal with Putin yet because you don't negotiate with, I believe he said, terrorists or dictators. That's what he told Zelensky. So Zelensky scrapped the deal. And now here we are, 3 years later, about 1 million people dead, all thanks to the fact that Boris Johnson went and messed up that deal. So this is the mindset that has been very prevalent throughout Europe and throughout DC. We see this on mostly the Democrats, but there's also the warhawk Republicans like Lindsey Graham. This is what we see. We see this neoconservative revival, and in that we all have to have Ukrainian flags in our Instagram bio and our Twitter bio to show we're good people. That's the game. You have to have the Ukrainian flag, and the perfect mix is if you have the Ukrainian flag and the Israeli flag. If you're like Lindsey Graham, someone like a really good person, because you advocate for weapons sales and you advocate for making money for your lobbyists in Lockheed Martin or Raytheon that profit off of the endless death and destruction of all these other countries across the world, so that Lindsey Graham, who gets campaign contributions from those same companies, can stay in power. That's the game here. And it's sickening because all of these people in the West, these main figures that for some reason run our society, are some of the most sick, deranged people in the world because they directly or indirectly profit or gain prominence from the death of all these people. That's the game we're playing here. And this guy in France, this French general, I'm sure is no different. I don't know his financial information, but I'm sure, just as all the people in the West here, in America here are, all of these leaders are just in the pockets of all these big weapons corporations. And I'm sure France and Europe, or France and England and the rest of Europe aren't very different. But Zelensky's initial response to this was that he put out a 10-minute video to the Ukrainian people in response to this peace deal because he was very upset with it at the start. And in that video, he says, it's going to be a very cold winter for Ukraine, or a very dark winter for Ukraine, basically scaring his civilians to death. And he said that Ukraine will have to pick between its dignity or its key strategic partner being the United States. He didn't say the United States, but that's what he was signaling. He's signaling that he feels United States support for Ukraine is dwindling. And he would be correct. American citizens, the American people, are sick and tired of being unable to afford a home, being unable to afford health insurance, being unable to afford basic services and products because our dollar value has been completely destroyed. We've debased the currency because we have been printing hundreds of billions of dollars in the Federal Reserve to send away to Ukraine. And as a result of that money, here's what we've got. Here's what we've got after printing hundreds of billions of dollars to fund Ukraine's war for the past almost 4 years. We've gotten higher priced housing because of the inflation. We've gotten higher priced basically everything because of this inflation. We've debased the currency pretty much faster in a 4-year period than we almost ever have, besides probably COVID. And what has Ukraine gotten? Ukraine is losing the war. After all the money and weapons that we've sent them, after we've destroyed our own economy, after we have lost the US dollar as the world reserve currency because of these sanctions on Russia, after we've destroyed our economy and the global economy, what we've gotten is Ukraine is actually losing. After we've been told for years that if we just send this one more aid package, that'll get Ukraine over the top. They'll be able to invade Russia even. This is what we're told. Lindsey Graham goes on Face the Nation and brags about how this is the greatest deal of all time because we get to kill half the Russians and save some money, whatever his deranged math on this is. That's the idea, that this is good money well spent. But the reality is that Zelensky's right when he thinks that the West is getting sick of this, because American citizens are sick and tired of seeing our politicians worship these foreign countries while our money's being devalued by it. So it's enough's enough. Trump needs to, and good for Trump and good for Witkoff here for trying to find peace here, because enough is enough, and we need to prioritize our own country again, because this is just absolutely insane. Whether it's here, whether it's in Ukraine or whether it's in Israel, the prioritization of foreign countries and foreign conflicts is really destroying our currency is the main thing, and that trickles down to everything else. So good for the Trump team. Good for Steve Witkoff. But the next topic here I want to cover, we're going to move on now to Israel, is Mike Huckabee's insane meeting, his ridiculous meeting that got exposed just yesterday by the New York Times. So back in July, not Zelensky, what am I even talking about? Mike Huckabee, another ridiculous man, he had a meeting, an unplanned, uncoordinated with the White House meeting at the U.S. Embassy in Israel with Jonathan Pollard. And you may know I've mentioned Jonathan Pollard here on the show a couple times. Jonathan Pollard was the convicted spy for Israel. He was convicted back in 1987. He was convicted for sending millions and he worked in U.S. intelligence. He worked in U.S. intelligence and was sending millions of documents of intelligence to Israel during the Cold War. Back in 1987, he got convicted, and he was sentenced to life in jail. He spent pretty much about 30 years in jail until he was eventually he was put on parole, I believe, back like 10 years ago, and he went right back to Israel. He was welcomed, and he was given a hero's welcome by Benjamin Netanyahu. So here's the New York Times article in question here that basically exposed this yesterday. This caused massive bombshells. Here it's titled, Huckabee held meeting at U.S. Embassy with American who spied for Israel. And it says, quote, Ambassador Mike Huckabee, President Trump's envoy to Israel, met at the United States Embassy in Jerusalem in July with Jonathan J. Pollard, an American who spent 30 years in prison for spying for Israel, Mr. Pollard said. The highly unusual meeting caught some U.S. officials by surprise and appeared to be a sharp break with years of precedent for American diplomats. The New York Times learned of the meeting from 3 U.S. officials who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive information. When the Times asked Mr. Pollard about the meeting, he confirmed it. Mr. Pollard said it was the first time that a U.S. official had hosted him at an American government office since his release a decade ago. It was a friendly meeting, said Mr. Pollard in a phone interview on Wednesday. The meeting with Mr. Pollard, a former naval intelligence analyst, was kept off Mr. Huckabee's official schedule, 2 of the U.S. officials said. The fact that it occurred alarmed the CIA's station chief in Israel, 3 of the officials said. The CIA declined to comment. The White House was not aware of the meeting in advance, according to a White House official, and 2 people briefed on the matter. The White House official also said that senior officials there were alarmed when they learned that it had taken place. And what else can you say about this? It's absolutely insane. Mike Huckabee, for those who don't know, he's the ambassador to Israel. We showed him a couple, I believe like a month ago or a couple weeks ago here on the show. We showed the clip of him singing Sweet Home Jerusalem and some play on Sweet Home Alabama back at some Israeli charity festival or something. And this guy is completely invested. His entire political ideology, it's all he talks about, is how invested he is in protecting Israel. He is, if you looked in a textbook at American politician who prioritizes other countries over his own, Mike Huckabee's face would appear in the biggest possible format. His entire political career has been based in defending Israel. And now, after months and months of defending what Israel has done in Gaza, after months and months of negotiating with Israel basically to the benefit of Israel and not to the benefit of the United States, after months of making excuses for Israeli settler attacks in the West Bank, for making excuses for basically the bombing of Qatar, for making excuses for the endless destruction of Gaza. After months of all this, Mike Huckabee then decides in July to meet in a private meeting, in a meeting that Pollard said was very friendly. He decides to meet with Pollard off schedule and basically in private. The fact that it wasn't released until now means it was probably trying to be kept secret. He meets with Jonathan Pollard, this convicted spy for the Israelis. one of the most notorious spies in American history. And he has a friendly meeting with him. And it came out, videos were going around on Twitter from like 14 years ago, I believe, of Mike Huckabee even 14 years ago lobbying the Obama administration to free Jonathan Pollard. So Mike Huckabee has a reputation of shilling for Israeli spies, and it's unbelievable that how is he not fired? How does he not have his job? Or how does he have his job still? I've seen all the prominent people with connections to the administration, people like Steve Bannon, calling for him to be fired. How is he not fired? How do we not understand the PR around this? That this is a terrible look. And this isn't the first time, by the way, in this second Trump term that something like this has happened in this administration, where people in this administration are actively working against the interests of America on behalf of Israel. Mike Waltz, we talked about him months ago for his Signalgate scandal. He was the former national security advisor, and then he got removed from that position and put at the United Nations. Now he's the ambassador to the UN, a much less consequential role. But Mike Waltz was caught, and you can look this up. The Washington Post reported on this. The real reason, the unannounced reason that he was really fired from being national security advisor was because he was caught by Trump basically secretly messaging and strategizing with Benjamin Netanyahu back in February and they were talking about trying to lobby Trump into bombing Iran. Our national security advisor, Mike Waltz, was directly messaging the Prime Minister of Israel, strategizing on how to get the President of the United States to agree to bombing Iran for Israel. This is true, but look this up. This is all 100% factual. It's absolutely insane. I'll read it right here. I have it pulled up, actually. This is from the Jerusalem Post from back in May, but the report is about the February texts. It says, quote, part of the reason why the U.S. President Donald Trump dismissed National Security Advisor Mike Waltz was due to behind-the-scenes coordination with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on possible military action against Iran without the president's full knowledge or approval, the Washington Post reported on Saturday. According to the report, which cited multiple senior administration officials, tensions between Waltz and Trump have been mounting for weeks. Waltz allegedly worked closely with Netanyahu to prepare military options in advance of a February Oval Office meeting, a move he reportedly made without informing the president. So, this Mike Waltz, the national security advisor to Donald Trump, secretly was strategizing with the prime minister of a foreign country about strategy to get Trump to bomb Iran before an Oval Office meeting. And instead of being fired in the most public, embarrassing way, he just gets moved to a new position. So, okay, excuse number one. And then in July, Ambassador Mike Huckabee decides to meet in Israel with a former Israeli spy, a convicted Israeli spy, the biggest spy in American history. And it's purposely kept secret and kept off the schedule. And it gets exposed in a bombshell New York Times report months later. And the White House says again, they were not aware the meeting took place. And then, for anyone else who forgot, if this got memory hold or something, just a couple months ago, we had an Israeli diplomat in Las Vegas get caught in an FBI local police sting trying to meet up with a child over a dating app. And instead of being arrested and put on trial, he gets in with this, and he, at the request, essentially, of a Trump-appointed prosecutor, he's allowed to flee back to Israel and gets a hero's welcome from the Israelis. So this is a repeated pattern of people in this administration, in these positions, former national security advisor, ambassador to Israel, and a prosecutor, all collaborating with Israel to go against the interest of America on behalf of the Israeli government. So we have had basically 3 separate instances now of this, and not one major firing, not one warning to the administration, not one person being made the example of, that no, you can't just go behind the president's back and work for a foreign government. Actually, your role is in an American government. You can't work for the Israeli government. Instead of anyone being made an example of, it's allowed to happen time and time again. And we'll see what happens with Huckabee. I'm sure he won't be fired. I mean, if he is, then I'll be very happy with that, because he should be. But why would we expect that? when Mike Waltz wasn't even viciously publicly fired. He was just moved to a different position. So this is the ridiculousness that we keep seeing repeatedly. And when people criticize people mentioning that the Israel lobby has a strong grip over our politics, what do you say to this? I mean, this is very clear examples of our own politicians working on behalf of a foreign country. What else can you call this? That's what this is. Mike Huckabee is the U.S. ambassador to Israel. He doesn't work for Israel. He still works for the U.S. government, yet he's having secret meetings with their spies. It's secret friendly meetings with their spies. It's unbelievable. So we had some good news today and some insane news today, but that's where I think I'll wrap it up for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Also, please be sure to go follow me on Instagram, X, and Spotify, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Have a good day.
Americanism, not globalism.
I am not a slave. I am a free citizen.
There should be no Federal Reserve System.
Only America first.